Okay, let's start this final session. So this is the sixth of 6 lectures on the theme of camouflage revisited. The idea behind these sessions is to look at a number of two seminal books on architectural theory that looked at the question about the gaze and to reevaluate them sometime later. One was written in 1999 and one published in 2006. And I want to try and do so. I have been trying to do so in the context of more contemporary technological advances. I'm not sure that this particular session has so many references to the world of AI, the world of AR, VR, to the metaverse, to interactive design, and so on. Although I do have one final project at the end, which engages with both interactive design and also the world of AI. What I do want to do, though, is to try and pick up on some of the kind of thoughts, the comments that were made during the course of the past 5 days and tie them together, especially in the context of questions of identification. In some ways, we've spoken about how we need to identify, we need to find connections. We need to find connections in terms of design itself as a logic of connectivity. And as we were talking about yesterday, for artists, the ideas of being connected are vital. The idea that art allows them to transcend their melancholic condition, and engage with the world, or perhaps the life world would be a better description. I want to look today at questions of identification, of identity, and actually talk about the way in which this particularly happens, both in terms of individual identity and also in terms of collective identities. So, broadly speaking, the focus is this question about the image and the role of the image in architectural culture. My argument is that architects are, and always have been, obsessed with images. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? And in the first two lectures, Reality and Aestheticization, which were based on the book, The Anesthetic of Architecture, I offer a very negative critique of the role of the image, the danger, as it were, of aestheticization. And the problems, of course, therefore, associated with certain projects that somehow do not address important political issues and get caught up in the world of the image. An example I was talking about was the NEOM project that architects have been engaging with. The final 4 lectures, though, are taken from the book and the Camouflage, which is much more positive about the role of the image and sees it as an important aspect of identity, of who we are, of the way in which we operate in the world, and it's much more subtle, much more dialectical. The first book was more a kind of polemical, one-sided view of the world. This is a much more balanced, shall we say. So, and these are the 2 books, The Anesthetics of Architecture on the left-hand side, that came out in several different languages, including Chinese, and Camouflage, which I thought was a much more sophisticated book, but which didn't come out in so many languages, partly because, as far as architects were concerned, it was a bit overly theoretical. I actually think it's a very nice book, but anyway. So today, then, I'll be talking about Camouflage. And I want to start off with a rather curious phenomenon that we find. Anyone who's been to Hong Kong, and certainly I've not been there since COVID, but up until COVID, and I'm sure it's still continuing, there was this very strange practice on a Sunday whereby all the Filipino workers would come out into the central business district in Hong Kong and gather. They would meet, they would gather together in groups where they would have lunch, they would talk, they would give each other massages, haircuts, and so on. This was an astonishing ritual where they took over and colonized spaces otherwise used for business and use them for themselves. Denied any place where they could work at home, these Filipino workers typically live in very tight, have very tight living quarters. They take to the streets, and they take over. They appropriate these spaces each Sunday in a really an astonishing ritual that is remarkable for all sorts of different sort of reasons. And this, of course, allows us to kind of question in some way the role of space itself. Can we talk about private space? Can we talk about public space? Can we assign those terms to space? Or do we have to recognize that somehow that space itself is always subject to these temporary strategic appropriations? This particular view is of the undercroft of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong, designed by Norman Foster. I'm not sure that Norman Foster expected to have thousands of Filipino workers gathering under his building every Sunday. Maybe Bernard Shumi, who has always been a proponent of the idea of an event space and always hoped that people would take hold of his pavilions in the Parc de la Villette in Paris and appropriate them and use them as event spaces, spaces where things would happen. Well, whether or not that happens, certainly this happens every Sunday, and it's remarkable. It's an astonishing thing. I understand that it happens in other parts of the world where there are Filipino workers. The Filipinos, I should say, are domestic maids. They have a role, an important role in Hong Kong society, in servicing, shall we say, the families that live there. And you can see how they demarcate these spaces with a kind of primitive but a kind of architectural way. They lay out these cardboard areas and they claim them. They claim them as part of their space, as it were. And this is a ritual that goes on every single Sunday. It's a very beautiful ritual in many ways. It's a very unusual ritual. And yet it has become part of Hong Kong life. Of course, on a Monday morning, the Central Business District returns to being the Central Business District. It's no longer what it was, but then every Sunday again, it is re-evoked. And this ritual goes on week after week after week. I want to use this as a kind of a background to what I'm going to talk about today, especially the question about identity and belonging and how we can use some of this as a kind of illustration of the ideas, particularly of Judith Butler. So these are the 6 topics I'll be looking at today. Identity to begin with. I want to start off by talking about the theories of Judith Butler, who I feature in the book at Camouflage, in the section on belonging. I then want to take that further to see how you can use her way of thinking and develop a theory of belonging to architectural spaces. I then want to open up in more general terms to the question of the politics of space, something that I've also written on that in a loose way relates to the theme of camouflage, but I want to use it to try and unpick some of the challenges, some of the assumptions that are written into architectural culture. How is space? How do we identify with space? And I want to take that then to a larger level, to the level of national identity, to what is national identity and how can we see that constituted? I then want to offer a critique of critical regionalism, something I find problematic, but all too pervasive within architectural culture. And finally, I want to talk about some post-colonial theories, the work in particular of Homi Bhabha, whom I've spoken about in the past and who is central to this, to see how we might see some forms of strategies of resistance within the post-colonial era against the colonial power itself. So let me start off with this this video of Judith Butler is being played. And let me just simply say that Judith Butler is a professor of critical theory in University of California in Berkeley, one of the most significant thinkers, I would say, of our time and most significant theorists of feminism. What makes us so distinctive and slightly different to what we've been talking about in this course is that basically she's not dealing with the question of representation, with the question of image. Rather, she's a kind of process-based philosopher who looks at the question of performance and how performance is essential to who we are. Now, Butler's a theorist of feminist theory, and especially more specifically of gender theory and of lesbian theory. The central view that she takes is that we should be cautious of an kind of an essentializing way of approaching gender politics, and that gender politics is not based on our bodies. Her argument basically is because she has two breasts, because she's got a female body, doesn't mean that she has to conform to the normative heterosexual model of how one should behave. Rather, she claims, we can redefine ourselves. We can redefine ourselves through our, what she calls performativity, and this is probably the most important term in her whole work. The idea that it is not to be reduced to performance as such, but rather through our performativities, through the kind of ritualistic behaviors, the repetition, the citational logic of that repetition, we can, as it were, redefine ourselves. We don't have to be based on our biological bodies. We can be based on gender identities that are part of the way in which we behave. In other words, we are not trapped. We can reinvent ourselves. In some senses, then we can see this as a kind of critique of the work of someone like Pierre Bourdieu. Well, Pierre Bourdieu talks about the notion of habitus. Out of habit, certain things become instantiated, and that's the way they are. They get repeated and repeated, and they become hegemonic. Now, what Judith Butler is arguing is that, sure, they are repeated and repeated and repeated. But if we change what we repeat, we can instantiate a different order. We can introduce a different way of behaving. In other words, what she's beginning to get towards is the notion that actually that all forms of gender, not just lesbian gender, but also heterosexual gender, is based on the logic of repetition, of mimicry, of repetition of previous models. We are kind of encouraged to follow the logic of what's gone on before, and that's the model we have. That's the model we are instructed to be given, and that's the model that is the dominant world model. But once you realize that it is simply a kind of repetition of something else, you can change that model. You can make it work for yourself. And of course, not to reduce these things down into the same sort of, not to be over reductive about this, but you can imagine that the same kind of principles could be applied to all sorts of questions of identity, not just simply gender, but also cultural identities and so on. We can understand that they can all be understood as based on a logic of performativity, not what things look like, but what is actually happening. In other words, identity is something that is fluid. It can change, and it is based on performativities, on the way that you actually behave. Now, that's an interesting fact in itself. I should also say that there is actually a performativity to the gaze itself. Interestingly, Judith Butler takes the example, this is the Rodney King video, famous moment in Los Angeles when the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, beat up an African-American. And what she says is that, if you can go back to that, what she says is that video, to watch that video as an African-American is to, in a sense, to reinforce the sense of what it is to be an African-American. So it has a potential that can be used, deployed in all sorts of arenas. Now, I want to look at one particular aspect of that, the way in which we can understand the logic of these performativities, these operations that are happening, and how they help to, in some senses, to instantiate us, to connect us in a certain way with a certain architectural space. One of the comments that's been made about Judith Butler's work is the fact that it's about remembering. In other words, we literally, in a literal sense, re-memoring, we are, in a sense, remembering. Every time we go back there, every Sunday, we are part of it. We are reenacting something. And through that, there is a kind of repetition that is at work. And that notion of repetition is important to understand how we break down notions of alienation and how we connect, how we break down, connect with a kind of certain kind of space. And it hasn't got to be on a Sunday in Central District in Hong Kong. It's what we do, frankly, every day. When we walk up a staircase, when we perform the certain rituals that we do every day, we clean our teeth, we make coffee, we do all these different sort of things. And when we do those things, the repetition that is involved is continually playing upon ourselves. Now, that notion of repetition, of somehow breaking down alienation, sorry, these are going on by themselves, so that idea of breaking down alienation is central, of course, to the whole work that we're looking at of Kusama's, the idea that she could, by repeating, she could overcome some of these kind of traumas that she had, the trauma, as it were, of melancholia. Now, the logic of this notion of repetition overcoming alienation comes from Freud. Freud talks about it, and he gives the example of a child who is disturbed because its mother is leaving the room. The mother is moving from the kitchen to the dining room or something, and the child gets traumatized by this. And as a way of overcoming the trauma, the child develops a kind of game as a kind of device to overcome it. And the game, Freud calls it Fort Da. It involves throwing something on a spool out of the cot, and then retrieving it. And it is through miming these things that you can actually, as it were, overcome them. So repetition becomes a way of avoiding alienation. And that notion of repetition that we saw in Kusama, of continually painting these polka dots, allows her to somehow transcend herself, to obliterate herself, and therefore become one, as it were. Yesterday we were looking at both Francesca Woodman and Kusama, and I thought that some of the comments about Francesca Woodman, I was a little cautious about this idea that she's not disappearing when she's wrapping herself in wallpaper. Some of the images that I use in Camouflage, I would prefer to keep to the logic of Kusama, who really is trying to obliterate, who is trying to lose herself in her paintings, and to lose herself in a way by repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. This was an image that I this was an image that I generated using Midjourney, where you literally see her camouflaged against the backdrop. The polka dots are actually all around her, and also in the clothing. She has become part of the world around her. So let me then more generally want to talk about the notion of the politics of space, and to try and understand how space itself is politicized. Because what we had there was a model that we got from that we saw in Hong Kong, whereby the notion of what space is was actually being renegotiated continually every Sunday, indeed every Monday, it's continually under negotiation. So how do we understand the connection between architecture, between the physical environment and politics itself? In particular, I want to pick up on a theme that a lot of architects seemed interested in addressing, the idea that somehow architecture can promote democracy. How is that possible, I would ask? So I want to start by commenting, and I'm not sure that many know, that the famous book by Le Corbusier, Vers une architecture, Towards a New Architecture, the original title proposed by Le Corbusier was Architecture ou Révolution, Architecture or Revolution. And the basis of this was the idea that Le Corbusier held, that basically good architecture could prevent revolution. If we design things in a certain way, it would avoid revolution. And one could be suspicious of this in some ways, because it was following on from the Marxist revolutions, the left-wing revolutions that had been going on in Europe. And of course, Le Corbusier aligned himself with the Vichy government during the Second World War, so I suspect his politics weren't exactly progressive in some sense. Nonetheless, he held this view that architecture had the power, the potential to influence politics. And we see a repetition of that in the work of Charles Jenks. Charles Jenks and Maggie Valentine wrote about democracy and asked this question: what is the architecture of democracy? And the example they give are these kind of variegated gables on a canal in Amsterdam, as though that is a form of democracy. Well, they're different forms of gables, but I don't quite see how you can connect them with any form of politics. And let me maybe explain why. Similarly, in the Reichstag in Berlin, Norman Foster has supposedly given us an example of an architecture that is transparent, where you can see democracy at work. In this main cupola, you can actually look down, as you see these people looking down over the main chamber of the German government. And the idea is that therefore things have been transparent and it's a democratic society. But being able to see something symbolically doesn't necessarily mean it's democratic, because democracy is about participation. And the idea that somehow form can govern a type of politics, this is something that we referred to in the previous lecture, especially the discussion about Neon the Line. Now, what I argued then was basically the fact that the line seems to be, as it were, totalitarian in its form. It's relentless, it's in a line and so on, doesn't make it totalitarian. It's really a question of what happens there. Now, this is the Karl Marx Allee in Berlin, and here's another version of it when it was first completed. The Karl Marx Allee, which also is a kind of an avenue, a kind of, in some sense, totalitarian in its form, that is carved through the fabric of Berlin, but that doesn't make it totalitarian. What makes it totalitarian, I would claim, was the fact that at a certain moment during the construction of that avenue, the workers rebelled or protested against the conditions in which they would be, their working conditions. And as a result, the Russians brought the tanks in, and the Soviets brought the tanks in, and 11 of them were killed. It's that was political, the killing of 11 workers, not the form of the avenue itself. And what is interesting about form is that you can get the same form in different contexts, in different countries, and it means something completely different. This is the chancellery of Adolf Hitler, also in Berlin. And you can see the kind of stripped down classical columns, classical architecture, language of classical architecture that Albert Speer is using here. But at the same time, that is the same language you would find elsewhere in Europe at the same time. There are plenty of libraries and civic buildings in the UK, for example, that have a similar form of stripped down classicism. It doesn't mean that classicism is somehow fascist in some way. It can become, in a particular context, the word in stone, as Hitler put it. It can become the word in stone, but it depends on its context. Take it out of that context, put it in another context, put it in another country, and it no longer has the same meaning. And of course, we can look at the question of time as being another set of contexts. The column, there's nothing about the column intrinsically that makes it fascistic. In fact, the column was first created in Greece, the cradle of democracy itself. So how can we say that a column is in any way fascist? And this is a comment that Fredric Jameson makes, and I think it goes to the heart of the issue. The idea that somehow forms had and that were in and of themselves endowed with a political and even revolutionary potential by virtue of their intrinsic properties, in other words, by virtue of their form, is one of the big mistakes. Instead, what Jameson argues is that basically you have to understand that the meaning of a work of art, the meaning of architecture, is something that is, in a sense, grafted onto it. It's not something that can be guaranteed, even though it was intended in the beginning to be to have a certain politics, to embody certain politics. You can't necessarily guarantee that for the future. I've come to think that no work of art or culture can set out to be political once and for all, no matter how ostentatiously it labels itself as such. For there can never be any guarantee that it'll be used the way it demands. A great political art, Brecht, can be taken as a pure and apolitical art. Art that seems to want to be merely aesthetic and decorative can be rewritten as political with energetic interpretation. The political rewriting or appropriation, then, the political use must be allegorical. By allegorical, he's referring to, for example, paintings from the Renaissance. They all had a story behind them. We call that the allegory. It's a story that is connected with the painting, that explains the painting, but you've got to know the story to understand the painting. You have to know this is what it's supposed to be or mean. In itself, it is inert. In itself, it is inert. Architecture in itself is inert. That's something that doesn't go down well with certain people, but I think it's entirely logical. So I wanted to also turn to Michel Foucault, another kind of important philosopher who has spoken on these things. And Foucault, of course, was famous for the notion of the panopticon, which actually is not, he uses this as a diagram for how society operates. Even though he shows a building, he's not talking about the building so much as how a society operates. And it's not so much about the panopticon as such as a building, and more about panoptical society, the way in which society operates following the model, as it were, of architecture. And the story behind this, as many of you will know already, is that there is in this design, which is intended as initially as a prison. It could be used for other things, but intended as a prison. There is a central tower, which can be seen here on plan here, and around the outside are arranged the cells for the prisoners. And here's a prisoner in his or her cell looking out towards the tower where the guards are stationed. Now, the clever thing about this is that there is a kind of gauze or something that is preventing the prisoner from knowing whether or not he or she is being watched by the guards. But according to Foucault, because of this, then you're kept under potential suspension. The idea that you are always potentially being subject to surveillance, and that is what guarantees, in his terms, the subjectification of the prisoner. In other words, the panopticon is what kind of leads to the control of thing. So what we've got, though, is not just a physical form. We've also got a kind of practice going on, a practice of surveillance involving the guards in the center. Now, most people just look at the building and say, okay, that's the panopticon, that's the form, and it guarantees that people behave. It doesn't. It's the fact that it is a prison, that it's operating as a prison, that really makes the difference. It is the practices that are going on there that really define it in that way. And of course, there were many versions of this built as actual prisons. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be used in that way. We're familiar, of course, with the question about surveillance through the logic of Big Brother. In his novel 1984, George Orwell predicted how we would be subject to a surveillance society. And maybe we are in some ways now, a surveillance society that was watching us in what we do. But there are certain reasons why we should maybe question whether that necessarily is the case. Now we live in a culture of Big Brother where the opposite holds true. It's not about being controlled by the gaze, but rather playing to the gaze, playing in front of the television, playing in front of the cameras, and being very much aware of it. In other words, if you could imagine that the panopticon was not being used as a prison, but was being used as a kind of discotheque or something very different would be happening. And of course, we see this in other buildings as well. It hasn't got to be necessarily be, but malign. This is the library, James Stirling's History Faculty Library in Cambridge, where I study. Not much liked by the history professors. I actually was as a postgraduate student, I was a tenant in a house owned by a history professor, and he absolutely hated this building. But the principle of the building was the fact that you could, it was laid out in the days before we had electronic tagging for books, where you could see there was a central kind of desk when you could see radially what people were doing, and you could check whether someone was going to put a book in their pocket and steal it and so on. Of course, now we have electronic tagging, and of course, now we have surveillance cameras. In many ways, those surveillance cameras are also performing the same role. But it's important also in terms of that the George Orwell model to realize that maybe surveillance is not necessarily a bad thing. In the UK, we had a famous incident when there was a baby that was abducted and killed by two young boys. And the reason they found the boys was that the surveillance cameras for a certain store, a certain shop called Mothercare, caught them in the act. And many people are very happy to have surveillance cameras there because they feel safer because they know that they're being watched. But the central principle is there. On the motorways in the UK, we have these little boxes that are watching us. They're watching us when we're driving. And we don't know if there's any film in the camera, but there's potentially a film in the camera. So you have to slow down for these cameras. You know you might be fined for speeding. But Foucault's comment, though, is that these are not going to guarantee any particular politics. And especially they're not going to guarantee any kind of democratic politics. I do not think there is anything that is functionally, by its very nature, absolutely liberating. Liberty is a practice. Liberty is a performance, and all forms of politics are a performance. And he carries on, referring to Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, who is described today with a sort of cruelty that I find perfectly useless as a sort of crypto-Stalinist. He was, I'm sure, someone full of good intentions, and what he did was, in fact, dedicated to liberating effects. Perhaps the means that he proposed were in the end less liberating than he thought. But once again, I think they can never be inherent in the structure of things. Architecture can never be inherent in the structure of things to guarantee the exercise of freedom. And here's the important comment. The guarantee of freedom is freedom. It's not dependent on architecture. And of course, this is the kind of famous vision that, of course, Le Corbusier has been criticized for, the kind of ville radieuse model of seemingly totalitarian architecture, but it's not in itself. And then he goes on. If one were to find a place, and perhaps there are some where liberty is effectively exercised, one would find that this is not owing to the order of things, or order of objects, but once again, owing to the practice of liberty. It's not the fact that panopticon is the shape it is that is so important. It's the fact that it is operating as a prison, because if it were operating as a discotheque, it'd be something entirely different. And he makes the comment, though, that I think that architecture can and does produce positive effects when the liberating intentions of the architect coincide with the real practice of people in the exercise of freedom. So in other words, the panopticon works because the form, actually, when it's in conjunction with the operations of a prison, make it an effective prison. So from that point of view, it's when the form can align with that it makes sense. But in and of itself, it doesn't guarantee anything. I think our problem in architecture is we tend to sort of label things. We tend to label things as public space or private space or totalitarian or democratic or whatever, and really overlook the fact that the key question is actually how they're being used. This, for example, is the famous building in Paris by Jean Nouvel, designed by Jean Nouvel, Institut du Monde Arabe, the Institute of Arab Culture. And you'd think that this was a kind of celebration of Arab culture. Of course, it's famous for these this kind of shading device, this kind of based on Arabic patterning that, of course, never worked very well because it's seized out. But nonetheless, that was the intention, to be a kind of celebration of Arab culture. But when it comes down to it, you see, well, okay, but where are the Arabs? I mean, there are plenty of kind of elegant Parisians going to this institute and having their couscous and so on a Sunday afternoon. But where are the Arabs? The Arabs are working in the kitchen. In other words, far from being a celebration of Arab culture, it seems to be a celebration more of a kind of post-colonial colonialism. And this idea that somehow that buildings can, not just simply you can misread them, but also they can change their reading. This is the Ceausescu's palace in Bucharest that we were talking about. This monstrous palace that used up all the resources of the country and led to the revolution in many ways, with an avenue in front of it that is kind of longer than Versailles even. And the idea is therefore that and everyone criticized this at the time. When I was part of doing lots of things in Romania, and people were saying that this is a terrible building, look what's happening, and we despise it. But over the years, it was reappropriated as the house of the parliament, the house of the people, and people now love it. Not architects, perhaps, because architects don't like the kind of kitsch postmodern architecture that involved it, but nonetheless, it is loved by the general population, which suggests that, in fact, architecture can change its meaning over time, depending on the way in which it is being perceived or used. Another example of this would be the South Africa House in London. This is you can see it here, but there's a swastika that has been projected onto the building by Christopher Zizek. Zizek is a professor at Harvard GSD, and much of his work is a deeply political one, where he's projecting things onto buildings in particular. And here is effectively evoking the way we project meaning onto the building. Just like the projector itself, we project meaning on the building based on the associations. So during the time of apartheid, when this particular performance was made, we viewed the South African regime, or at least most people viewed the South African regime, as being a kind of fascistic regime. So you project that onto it. But as soon as South Africa opens up onto a post-apartheid era, as soon as Nelson Mandela becomes the president of South Africa, then all of a sudden that fades, that swastika disappears as we begin to associate it as something else. And here we have the Union Buildings of Pretoria, where the South African government is housed. And at that moment, when in 1990, I think it was, Mandela became the president of South Africa, suddenly these buildings were redeemed. They were rinsed of their associations with apartheid and became the symbol, the emblem of a new post-apartheid South Africa. In a kind of symbolic way also, Nelson Mandela, while he was president, they had the first ever world championship for rugby. And in a symbolic act, he put on the South African rugby jersey in order, in a sense, to reappropriate it from the background that rugby enjoyed in South Africa, i.e., a very kind of Afrikaans-based, very right-wing sport. What was seen as a right-wing sport. Football was seen as the democratic one. It was seen as a right-wing sport that was played predominantly by the Afrikaners, who themselves, of course, was responsible for apartheid. And by putting on the South African jersey, as it were, Nelson Mandela redeemed and reappropriated the team for the rest of South Africa. And we can see this in architecture. We can see this the whole time in the way in which buildings, the form remains the same, or largely the same, but at the same time, the meaning changes because their use changes. So this is the Architectural Association in London, somewhere where I used to teach. And what is interesting about this particular building is that it was built as a house. Like the rest of the square, it was built as a house, a very elegant house, a 5-story it would have been, with possibly the servants in the basement and so on. But what's interesting, of course, is that not only has everything has changed now, and this has become a school of architecture, and round the corner, my publishers, Bloomsbury, have a very similar building. Now, therefore, you need to define these buildings, not in terms of their form, but in terms of the performances, the rituals, the practices that happen. What makes the AA a school of architecture is not its form. It's the fact that the seminars, the tutorials, the lectures, the crits and so on that are going on in its spaces, that's what defines them as being that. In other words, it's not a property, an intrinsic property of the form itself. And we could extend that to say, well, it's the same in terms of the politics and the gendering of architecture. Is there such thing as democratic space? Well, only insofar as democracy might operate there. But let's not assume that form can guarantee it. Let's not assume that if we put the chairs in a circle, in a democratic circle, that will guarantee democracy, because if Mussolini's there, it certainly won't. And let's not assume there are certain forms that are in and of themselves gendered forms. It's not the case at all, but if there are certain gendered performances going on in a space, that itself, in some senses, associates it with a particular politics and makes us connect it with those things. In other words, use becomes the fundamental determinant of the politics of a particular space. And the same goes for language. Ludwig Wittgenstein talks about, if we understand the meaning of a word, we've got to understand how it's been used. There's no point going to some book on structural linguistics to try and find out the meaning of the word. Just look at how it's been used. If I'm playing tennis against you and you do a shot, I do a shot, and that beats you, and you call me a bastard, it's not because you think I'm illegitimate. It's because that's what you might say on the tennis court. That's what people say. So we have to see how things are being used to understand their meaning, and their meaning will change as the use itself changes. As such, we can't assign anything, any particular determinant to spaces. This is a book by Marc Augé, which I find very conservative, Non-Places, Non-Lieu, where he talks about how in our age of supermodernity, our spaces are dominated by places that are not places. In other words, they're not encrusted with meaning in the same way that a church is, or historical places. And typically he critiques the kind of spaces of an airport, of the kind of transit spaces. These, for Marc Augé, are absolutely non-places in terms of his discourse. But then we look at someone like Reverend Koolhaas, who talks about how the airport has become one of the most important features of a city today. This is where all these kind of rituals take place, and where when a president lands, there's always a kind of some kind of welcoming committee for that, and so on. They are the spaces, the quintessential spaces, as it were, of our contemporary existence. So how does this play out in terms of national identity? We've already spoken about how, when we were talking about Joshua Bach in a few sessions ago, about how consciousness is a kind of narration. It's a story that we are telling that is kind of applied to these otherwise inert kind of mechanical entities. That the consciousness is us making a movie, as it were, a narration in some senses. And this is the work of Homi Bhabha, or at least the comments of Homi Bhabha, the Indian cultural theorist, who wrote a book called Nation as Narration. In other words, what defines a nation is not the physical form of a country, but the stories that people in that country tell about that country, the songs, the rituals, the things that they do in that country. And that is what it is. In other words, whereas in architecture, we always talk about the building as a building, which is very problematic. He talks about how that building, or how physical objects, are inscribed with a narrative and given meaning by that narrative. It is perhaps by following, this is my comments actually, it's perhaps by following the notion of the nation as narration, of identity as a kind of discourse put forward by Bhabha, that we can grasp the importance of understanding form as being inscribed within a cultural discourse. Of course, it would be wrong to reduce the nation to mere narration, as though form were totally unimportant. I mean, in some senses, you can't have a democratic space. There's something you just simply can't do in certain spaces. You can't have a football match in a telephone box. So form does play some role, but only a limited role. Rather, we have to recognize the nation as being defined within a dialectical tension. For Bhabha, this is the tension between the object and its accompanying narrative. In other words, it is the narration, the accompanying narrative, that makes sense of a nation. If then the nation is a kind of narration, is never an abstract narration, but a contextualized narration, inscribed around certain objects, and is precisely here within the field of objects that they have in themselves become the focus of narrative attention, that we must locate architecture as a language of forms, not only embedded within various cultural discourses, but also given meaning by those discourses. I think that becomes fairly self-evident. Slavoj Zizek also talks about the national identity in a kind of similar sort of way. For Zizek, in some senses, the notion of national identity is something in some ways, in a kind of invisible in some senses. We have to, as it were, cathect it. We have to project it onto certain sort of entities, onto certain physical forms and so on. And that's how we understand it. But it in terms of everyday terms, this thing might be understood as a way of life, a somewhat mysterious practice that remains accessible only to a certain group and is consequently always under threat from those who do not belong to that group and who do not subscribe to the same way of thinking. And what we don't like about foreigners is precisely the kind of the songs, the food and smelly food and so on. At least that's the way it is, the way that he perceives things. Prejudice comes because you don't like, in a sense, the way in which that identity has been inscribed within certain rituals. What role, therefore, might architecture play in such a setup? How might the very material condition of architecture relate to what amounts to little more than an immaterial belief system? The answer, it would seem, lies in understanding how that material world is itself inscribed within an immaterial belief system. And this is again picking up on Zizek's ideas. National identity is essentially a fantasy structure. From this perspective, in order for any national identity to be perceived, it must take the form of some material expression. National identity is therefore projected onto objects, and it must be embodied. Hence, objects such as national flags come to embody the identity through a process of a symbolic association. One might think of other things. One might think of maybe, what is it to be American? And there's certain sort of symbols, the baseball cap, the hamburger, and so on, that are somehow taken as representative of America. Just as, I don't know, the umbrella or the Financial Times or something could be seen as representative of the UK, or the baguette, the beret, and so on, of France, and so on, and so on, and so on. And these, of course, become ways in which we begin to articulate that sense of national identity. And this sense of national identity can be, in some senses, reinforced by the process of loss. We were talking about loss in the context of Christeva and in the context of Christianity, acting out certain questions of loss in the Mass through the identifying with Christ, the death of Christ, and so on. And that's important also in terms of consolidating the sense of national identity. This is a photograph that I took one day before the World Trade Center was attacked. I happened to have been up the building the day before, and of course this was the September the 10th, and took this photograph on the way to Staten Island. And the next day, of course, there was no World Trade Center; it had disappeared. And I think these kind of things are important because, as Zizek points, that the notion of identity is based on the theft of enjoyment. Someone has to be stealing your enjoyment, and that's what defines a community. There has to be some kind of sense of opposition. It's almost like a basketball team. It is defined by the competition against which it's taking place. And a country like the States saw its kind of, like, in some ways, that event was a kind of form of nation building because it brought the nation together in a similar way that maybe in Ukraine, as a result of the invasion by Russia, Ukraine itself has been to form a sense of national identity. It is important to have that national identity. And Zizek makes a comment that one of the problems in Eastern Europe following the collapse of the Soviet bloc was that there was no enemy. Everyone was embracing the West. And because of that, they had to find an enemy. And this led, in his terms anyway, to the growth of anti-Semitism in some of those countries. So let's move on to the question of regionalism, something that I think is being kind of, I would say, celebrated in many countries, and I find hugely problematic for different sort of reasons. And I want to introduce the thinking here of Fredric Jameson, who I've mentioned just briefly earlier on. And Fredric Jameson is a cultural theorist. He taught Michael Speakes, who's now a dean of Syracuse University School of Architecture in Syracuse, taught his PhD, but he's interested in architecture and he's been involved in architecture, but he's not an architect. And he first became involved in architecture when this particular when he visited this particular building, the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, which is a kind of developer-designed hotel and fairly anonymous, although you probably might have come across it because it appears in certain movies. This getting into the building is a bit of a kind of there's no obvious entrance, but you can walk in this way, and it has this kind of this mirror glass facade that makes it somewhat forbidding in some senses. Let me just, I think this might give you a little bit of the, this is the Governator appearing, Arnold Schwarzenegger appearing in the movie. So you probably, as chances are that you've, like most buildings in LA actually, they've been used as the backdrop for particular movies. And this one has been used for many movies. Anyway, but what really struck Perry Jameson when we went to the hotel was that not only was this a kind of anonymous hotel, it was difficult to kind of to penetrate in some sense, it's difficult to get into. But once you got inside, it was actually very anonymous. You really hadn't got a sense of where you are. There was the atrium here, but you had no bearings. You had no sense of how to get anywhere. It was completely confusing. And he took this as a kind of metaphor for the kind of the homogenizing space of late capitalism. Increasingly, our cities are becoming all the same. They're becoming generic cities. We have no sense of where we are. We cannot cognitively map ourselves into this space. And I mentioned before that it was this comment that what we need today is a viable form of aesthetic expression that reinserts the individual in society, that led in some senses to the pursuit of the book Camouflage. But anyway, he uses the basis of getting involved in architecture and tries to work out whether architecture can somehow give us a sense of where we are, of what we're doing. And initially, he goes to look at the work of Kevin Lynch because he was talking about reading the city, and then he realized that it's actually pretty banal. And then he goes to look at the work of Kenneth Frampton, particularly the idea of critical regionalism, the idea there can be some differentiation, some kind of difference as a way of somehow breaking up the homogenization of the world, the way in which the world has become all the same. But Jameson's thinking is very interesting here. He takes the line that the problem is that in the space of late capitalism, the homogenizing space of late capitalism, everything is co-opted into that space. Even these calls for difference. In other words, the call for difference, to have a different range of possibilities, to have a white iPhone, a pink iPhone, a blue iPhone, a green iPhone, that itself is part of the logic of the marketplace. In other words, instead of resisting the marketplace, these calls for difference are precisely part of the marketplace. In other words, critical regionalism is not resisting the homogenization of late capitalism, it is precisely feeding it. And you can see that actually, from that point of view, any discourse based on form makes little sense. If we take the notion of the tower block, you can see how that form is engaged with very differently in different countries. Here in Shanghai, there's a huge celebration of the tower block. In China, the taller the better. It's a sign of progress. If you look from the Bund on the other side of the river, then you'll find there are thousands of people every evening gazing across, looking at this vision of the new China. And it's celebrated. Whereas if you go to Berlin, you have these, what they're described as Plattenbau, these precast concrete buildings from the communist era that are despised. They're despised and they're being torn down because nobody wants to live in them. But what you're seeing is the same form in a different context, takes on a different meaning. In other words, the logic of critical region have different forms in different places doesn't really make sense. Or here on the left-hand side is the McDonald's. When it first opened in Moscow, it's since obviously closed, but you can see the massive queues to get in. Whereas, I mean, McDonald's in the West is, I wouldn't say totally vacant at this painting, but not so popular. And you can also see how even the same entity takes on different meanings in different contexts. So a Coca-Cola thing for some people, Coca-Cola can could be a sign of Western imperialism. For some people, it can be a sign of a cheap drink for other people. And at the same time, if you go to Europe, what's interesting, everybody has, apart from the UK, has most countries have the same coin, the euro. But then as soon as you start listening to the way in which people are pronouncing it, euro, euro, they all pronounce the word euro in a different way. In other words, it's been appropriated within the particular context, and therefore is already differentiated. You don't need a different form. It is seen in different ways, just as we mentioned before, this book by Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. The same city can be read in 12 different ways. As we find out once we've read the book, there are 12 different chapters looking at the same city, looking at 7 chapters, and in the end we find out they're actually different interpretations of the same city, just as these paintings of Rouen Cathedral by Monet are actually all of the same city, but seen in different lights and different contexts. So as such, we have to sort of question the reliance of a discourse or critical regionalism on form and think more about the kind of performances that are happening here. This Malaysian house on the right, a traditional Malaysian house, doesn't quite make so much sense once you have a Tesla car and once you're using the modern technology, air conditioning and so on. It becomes an empty sign in some sense, a pastiche, and therefore, in some ways, falls victim of the logic of postmodernism itself. So I want to move on now to post-colonial spaces to pick up on the work of Homi Bhabha, whom I've mentioned before. Homi Bhabha is a very significant scholar who originally came from India. He studied in the UK, and now he's a professor at Harvard. If you want to read his relevance of his work to architecture, there is a book by Felipe Hernandez, one of my former PhD students, now professor at Cambridge, which is called Homi Bhabha for Architects. And Homi Bhabha is an interesting figure because he challenges many of the orthodox views about the world. He's a thinker of hybridity, and he talks about how our world today is thoroughly hybrid, in a sense relating India to the UK, for example. On the left-hand side, we have the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh, the late Queen's husband, and he's been driven there in a Land Rover, a very traditionally British truck car, but it's now been bought by Tata of India, so it's no longer British. At the same time, cricket, which is the kind of national game in India, came from the UK. So we have this kind of hybrid thing, and now in the UK, the most popular dishes are some curry dishes like chicken tikka masala. So the world is already hybrid. It's not so clear cut. But he's famous for, in some senses, critiquing other more simplistic ways of approaching the question of post-colonialism. On the right-hand side, the great Edward Said, author of the book Orientalism, someone I always wanted to go and listen to. And I was in Colombia. He was unfortunately ill. He died with leukemia shortly afterwards, and I never got the chance to hear him. But Edward Said was famous for mounting this theory of Orientalism, whereby the West saw the East through a very kind of pejorative gaze. And by contrast, of course, the East saw the West often in a kind of far too kind of a positive sort of gaze. Not always the case, of course. But what Bhabha's saying is that is too simplistic. The world is not so straightforward, not only because it's hybrid, because there are different forms of operation at work. Another famous Indian theorist is Gayatri Spivak. Gayatri Spivak is also from India. She's famous as a translator of Jacques Derrida, and as an authority in the world of post-colonial studies, feminism, and so on. And Gayatri Spivak wrote a very famous essay once called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" as a kind of critique of the post-colonial era. And she critiques the way in which somehow, despite everything, it's still impossible for the colonized to really have a voice, even in the post-colonial era. She talks about, for example, how even if the British come in and they get rid of certain institutions like Suti, where typically in the past the widow would be expected to fling herself onto the funeral pyre of her husband. And she said, well, that lends up to this situation whereby white man tells brown woman how to operate in a certain things. And her view is that the situation is such that we are always already compromised, and there's no platform, there's no voice for the subaltern, by which she means the colonized, to have a voice. And Bhabha, by contrast, is always is challenging that. He's questioning that and arguing that actually there are far more subtle forms of resistance that can be employed. And I want to pick up on one because it picks up on the notion of mimesis or mimicry that we've been discussing in the last few weeks, the notion of colonial mimicry. What does Bhabha mean by this? Well, what he's basically kind of saying is that the repetition or the mimicry of something is not necessarily mean you're deferring to the authority of that. Rather, you can use mimicry in political ways to challenge that authority. This is me again quoted from Camouflage. Colonial mimicry for Bhabha is the desire for a reformed, recognizable other as a subject of a difference, which is almost the same but not quite. Almost the same but not quite. I think that's the important point. What emerges from this process is a disturbing rupture in the authority of colonial discourse, a disavowal that acts as a form of mockery. The menace of mimicry is its double vision, which in disclosing the ambivalence of colonial discourse also disrupts its authority. I mean, that might not be easy to understand for those who are not familiar with his language, but what he's saying is to copy something is not necessarily to be deferential. You can copy something and use it as a way of undermining that which you are copying by using it towards political ends. For Bhabha, repetition in the form of mimicry has a powerful political edge, since repetition forms the very basis of political satire, of political cartoons. The ironic reappropriation of a model through a satirical repetition can be an effective means of reconfiguring that model and challenging the assumptions on which it is based. It is here that mimicry exerts its influence. For Bhabha, it is almost the same, but not quite. It is in the almost the same, but not quite, that mimicry exerts its influence. And you can see this in cartoons. On the left-hand side, you have a photograph of Donald Trump eating a hamburger. And this is kind of repeated in a way, by this time by a British cartoonist, Gerald Scarfe, where he's basically repeating it, but twisting it in a way. There is this person with this obese stomach that has got ketchup dripping from everywhere. And this comment, "You are what you eat." It is Donald Trump. It is a representation of Donald Trump, but it's using it to, as it were, undermine Donald Trump. The almost the same, but not quite. And here is an interesting there is a German artist, I should say, called Thomas Demand, who what he does in his work is replicate certain things. And they have an uncanny relationship to the original because they are almost the same, but not quite. He makes these models out of cardboard and Yoo-hoo glue. And they're disturbing because there's this kind of like, you think, hold up, it doesn't quite look right, but I'm not quite sure what it is about it that makes it doesn't look right. So here we have Donald Trump in the Oval Office, and here we have Thomas Demand's Oval Office. And there are a series of other things that he produces, which are kind of destabilizing things. You're kind of copying things, replicating things, but because they're not quite the same, a bit like the satire itself, it has this kind of unnerving effect of challenging what it is that it's copying. So I want to show now a movie that is very controversial in many ways, that was produced as a kind of an indication or example of this, Les Maîtres Fous, the Mad Masters, and it's a movie that is about, well, I'll just play it. It's a movie that is about Africa, in which they kind of, in these rituals, these are kind of weird rituals, and you can see them wearing the pith helmets of the colonial rulers, and they are mocking them. They are mocking them. They are repeating certain rituals that the colonizer is doing, but these are absolutely destabilizing them and mocking them. On this little statuette, they're cracking an egg because they noticed that the ridiculous British people, rulers here, wore these absurd helmets with the plumes of feathers of various birds. Here you can see it, and therefore they're doing that as a kind of mockery. So this is a kind of empowerment. It's not mimicry as a form of deferential kind of comment, but mimicry used towards a political end like the kind of political satire, destabilizing. And this is a comment that basically Homi Bhabha is talking about, how mimicry can lead to a form of post-colonial critique. It is in these kind of subtle and not so obvious, but in many ways deliberate repetitions of a kind of colonial world that the colonized is in some sense having a voice. In other words, in contrast to Gayatri Spivak, who is claiming that the colonizer has no way of doing this thing, he's saying, no, by repeating and mocking through mimicry the kind of the Western governor, the Western colonial powers, these guys are reappropriating and taking themselves back and empowering themselves. Mimicry, in other words, is not necessarily deferential. It can also be used in a powerful historical way. The use of the pith helmet, the references to the colonial person, the cracking of an egg on this thing is clearly a reference to the absurdity of British colonial power and mocking the kind of regalia that is used in that area. I'm going to just go back to Gayatri Spivak a moment and pick up on something that I mentioned briefly, but I want to go through it again to explain it in more detail, talking about how there can be a voice, where the subaltern, the colonized, can have a voice, and using an example specifically from the world of AI. So the one moment in this entire lecture when I'm going to talk about these new technologies to look at this, and I want to go back to something that I mentioned in our discussion about interactivity, a project by Banaz Farahi called Can the Subaltern Speak? And as I mentioned, this is a deliberate reference to the world of Gayatri Spivak, and in a sense, what she's doing is, in a way, is actually responding and saying, yes, the subaltern can speak in a way. And this particular project, Banaz is from Iran, and she was noticed that there's a particular ritual in the south of Iran whereby women wear these masks, and they wear these masks. The logic, anyway, from this particular article, it is from the BBC. They said, well, this is presumably to avert, to hide from the gaze of the slave owners and things who would come to the country and select pretty women and use them. So what they do is, I mean, this is the theory anyway, that they wear these masks as a form of self-defense, as a form of resisting the colonizer, of averting the gaze or blocking the gaze in some ways. The other part that feeds into this particular project was a kind of curious historical moment that I think initially was misunderstood, when Facebook had two chatbots that were set up to communicate with each other. And what became a little disturbing at the time was they seemed to be developing their own form of language. They seemed to have developed their own form of language, and this unnerved the researchers, or at least this was the way that it is interpreted. I think actually they misunderstood what was happening. But there was a big outcry in the media for a while, where they realized that these AI bots could develop their own language and therefore ... In fact, it was a misunderstanding. It was simply a kind of a glitch in the program that led to this thing, and so on and so on and so on. And this particular AI was not capable, certainly not capable of some of the things that we can see today, and it certainly wasn't capable of thinking or indeed conducting a conversation. But nonetheless, the fact that you could be disturbed by this was also of interest. A third factor that fed into this was a famous case of an American admiral, Jeremy Denton, who was captured in Vietnam and held prisoner. And he was being interviewed here. And what he did as a kind of subterfuge was actually blink out using Morse code the word torture. Let's see if we can see it now. And so he was pretending he was kind of blinded by the lights of the spotlights, but actually what he's doing is blinking the word torture using Morse code. And that, I think, is fascinating. And what Banaz is doing in this project is bringing these all together, and it's a project about these women who develop these masks, and these masks can communicate with one another. They are able to, they use a Markov chain to develop a language, and they communicate with one another, and quite literally. And And it's unnerving to the male that these women can develop their own form of language. So let's go and see if we can play this. So I'm not sure if you got the sound there because I was not able. I'm just going to see if I can. I wasn't able to connect with my. No, it's still not letting me connect with my computer. I had the problem with the first lecture. It resolved because. Okay, my apologies. Never mind. There was no sound there, which is a shame. Well, there was a sound, but it wasn't being. I wasn't able to show it. So anyway, in some ways, the AI is famous because it is biased, because it has its problems and so on. But I would say that you could use AI in an intelligent way to overcome bias, to overcome prejudice, particularly in a kind of gendered way. So there are many possibilities there, but we could use that for. Let me just to sum up then, we come to the end of the 6 lectures. This was an attempt to try and broaden it out and to give a sense of how we can understand the role of identity and identity politics as a whole, and to think how this can be written into the logic of what we're talking about, and to see how mimicry has been played out in certain sort of ways. So on the one hand, we have Judith Butler, who's telling us that all forms of identity politics are based on a form of mimicry, of kind of copying the model that's been handed down, and we are expected to fit in. And that's therefore why gender politics can be seen as a form of drag, and architecture can be seen as a kind of space in which those drag politics are acted out as a form of a stage, a kind of a place of operations. And then at the end, I'm trying to argue that actually you could also use the logic of mimicry to undermine the system if you're following the logic of Homi Bhabha, to undermine it by mimicking, but in a subtle way whereby you are calling into question certain things. And in between, I'm trying to lay out and try to address some of the fundamental misconceptions, as I see it, in architectural culture about the failure to understand how actually space is political, and to failure to understand how the limitations of a discourse such as critical regionalism that is so endemic in architectural culture. How do we challenge these things? Well, my suggestion is in the context of the discourse of architecture and philosophy, to use the tools of philosophy, to bring them into an architectural arena in order to radicalize architectural theory, to get beyond the complacencies, of learning from Las Vegas, this simplistic kind of a view of how we should approach the world of the images, and contrast that to the radical work of someone like Guy Debord, calling into question this obsession with images, and taking that into other arenas as well, and thinking how we can challenge the neon, challenge the logic of all these architects signing up to go and work for someone who has been associated with the murder of a journalist. And only Norman Foster, as I understand it, resisted that and resigned from a collaboration as a result of the murder of this journalist. So we need to take on board these things as a way of radically critiquing, of questioning, of improving, as it were, architectural discourse. And it's only by critique that we can improve things. And maybe I can just finish, since in the background has been the world of AI, that it's not only been there challenging us to rethink thought itself, because as soon as you've got computers thinking, and maybe they are thinking, if we follow Geoffrey Hinton, then we've got to sort of really reevaluate what is our role in the universe, and also reevaluate what theory itself is. Theory is about thinking, and if AI can think, that completely challenges the whole domain of theory. But finally, let's just take this kind of model that we were talking about before of the GAN, the generative adversarial network, which is based on these two networks. One, the generator that is churning out images the whole time, and one, the discriminator that's looking at those images and challenging them and rejecting them and judging whether or not they're good enough. And the point about that is that the discriminator effectively trains the generator to get better. Critical discourse can improve design. And that, in a sense, is what I'm trying to espouse in this particular lecture series, how we can use the critical ideas outside of the typical architectural discourse to bring them into architecture in order to offer a much more critical and radical critique. The logic behind the book Rethinking Architecture that I produced many years ago was that architecture, the problem with architecture, it was operating as a kind of self-legitimizing cocoon, not paying attention to anyone outside. And we needed to kind of somehow burst that bubble and introduce these critical voices to really give architecture an edge. Anyway, this series will be uploaded onto the Digital Futures YouTube channel. Many of the work that has been spoken about here, much of it is on Instagram. My Instagram ID is Neil Leach, NEILLEACH 14. But there's also the Digital Futures one where you can find out about everything that we're producing. I'd simply say also that we have a series of workshops coming up. Most of them are now full. The online workshops, the main part, I think, of the festival this summer. And then in the closing ceremony on the 29th of July, we're going to have the Digital Futures we're going to have the Digital Futures Theory Prize, the Mark Cousin Theory Award. So let me end it there and invite questions from the audience. We already have one. If you're watching on YouTube or watching on Bilibili, if you want to ask a question, just send something in, and we can read it out and respond to it here. So just to, there's a question here from Gustavo. Thank you, Gustavo. You've been asking great questions all week. If identity and history are strong factors in reinforcing the canonical power structures, how do we find our way as a discipline to use alternative strategies to create new levels of societal awareness, using knowledge, contemporary philosophy, theory from decolonialism, post-colonialism, mimicry, and performance? How can we use AI or complex systems, computational models to inspire new change, new research frameworks for the architectural design field? Well, that's almost like a rhetorical question, because I mean, yes, but okay, no, absolutely. Well, I guess I was saying just now, you know, I think that that we should see theory as a tool. This is exactly what Deleuze, how he describes theory. Theory is a box of tools. I always think of it a bit like your car breaks down on the motorway or the freeway, and you call someone up. They have come in a van, a box of tools, a truck or something, and they fix your car. And it seems to me that's the role of theory, to kind of fix architecture in a sense, and introduce more critical awareness of things. I mean, I think there's a complacency, unbelievable complacency that's written into architectural discourse. I mean, the fact that Learning from Las Vegas is like one of the most famous books out there, the fact that critical regionalism is taught all over the world, is disturbing in some ways. I mean, I think we need to call into question, to challenge these things. Because, and the idea of problematizing things, this is a kind of concept that comes from post-structuralist philosophy. To problematize is to identify the problems. And the idea is not to destroy it. You don't destroy architectural culture. Rather, the idea is that you then take on board the criticism and you address it and say, okay, oh, you're right. I need to improve my argument. And, so it's a kind of, in the end, it's affirmative. It's not about a destruction of a culture at all. So, I think we absolutely we need to do that. What I would say now, though, is that we're now opening up beyond what used to be the hegemony of philosophy, and particularly post-structuralist philosophy, the work of Derrida, Deleuze, of Foucault, and so on, which was amazing in its own way. We now have new theoretical paradigms, especially neuroscience and AI, where people are addressing the question of intelligence and now begin to address the question of thought and therefore potentially theory itself. So that is already moved in, and there are more theoretical paradigms. There's a kind of shift, as it were. And we were talking about these kind of notions from Thomas Kuhn of the paradigm shift. Well, in some ways, we are going through a paradigm shift right now, leaving behind some of the work, especially, even though I mentioned it a lot, the work of psychoanalysis and using neuroscience, because neuroscience is somehow grounded in some kind of form of experimentation, of justification of some kind. That's not to say that it's totally useful, but it is justified in some ways. Of course, not everything needs to come from that. And we've noticed also someone like Arthur C. Clarke, who is a science fiction writer, who's made the most incredible comments without validating it at all. But in some ways, we also see that with Freud and Lacan, in the sense that they are supposing certain things. They're not proving anything. They're supposing there's an unconscious. They're supposing there's a mirror state and so on. It's not really based on any kind of demonstrable kind of scientific logic, but that is useful in itself. But we're moving into a kind of new paradigm. So I would say that is hugely important. How do we use contemporary AI and complex system community models to inspire new change, new research frameworks for the architectural design fields? Firstly, I would say that, I think that if we see that AI is in some ways a mirror in which we can understand what it is to be human, then automatically there is something there that could be useful. But secondly, I guess that we've often, there have been examples in history, and this has always been my obsession, or my hope in some senses, is that we can use these tools to actually show us what we're doing as the thing. So, I mean, the example I mentioned before a few sessions ago of Craig Reynolds developing these boids. He was interested in trying to model the behavior of birds. And he develops these boids that actually work quite well. And they do show, and so they did give the impression of a simulation of birds. I don't know how he managed to do that, how he managed to reverse engineer the flocking behavior, but he somehow did. And it was that allowed the bird experts, the ornithologists, to really understand bird behavior, which up until then they hadn't understood. So that is my hope, that in the end, we will be able to use these worlds to understand what it is to be human. And that has been the comment that has been made the whole time. I think I mentioned the Blade Runner, where Rutger Hauer, who played the central figure, the central replicant, made this comment that Blade Runner was not about replicants, it was about what it is to be human. So if we see this world as a mirror in which to understand what it is to be human, and that's not to say to see how similar we are to AI, but often to see how different we are. If we can use it, I think it will help us to move forward. It seems to me that one of the fundamental things I discovered in writing my first book on AI was that really, it seemed to me that what neuroscientists and AI experts were looking at was exactly the same thing. Some of them had done a PhD in AI and gone to neuroscience. Someone like Geoffrey Hinton had done a PhD in neuroscience, gone into AI, but essentially they were interested in intelligence and how the mind works. And I think that's important, to be able to understand how the architectural mind operates. So you don't have to have any other questions today. If anyone's got any other questions, please send them in. Does that make sense, Gustavo? Oh, here we are. Another follow-up. how can a new student follow the footsteps of a philosopher and a theorist? Or theorists, how do you do it in an age of AI? What skills are essential? Well, I would just simply say that I mean, I think and this goes really to what we're doing in Digital Futures as a whole, it's not just about theory, it's all about any form of information. And my perception is that not every school of architecture is so great. I'm told by Philippe Morel that there are a lot of professors in France who are complete dinosaurs. I don't know, I can't say, but what I would say is that what we're trying to do is make available materials that are for everyone. So, for example, it's like for AI. Now, how do you cover AI when things are changing every week, when most people don't know what the hell is going on? I mean, Mario Carpo's got no clue, absolutely no clue about AI. And yet he's pontificating from the Bartlett as though he does. What we need is a platform, a global platform, where we are actually checking those things and offering advice so the world can share it in some ways. And it's not just about AI, it's about everything. So what we're trying to do, and we've got a whole series in architecture and philosophy where we're putting up there, it's not so easy to find out about these things. These are often challenging. When I first heard some of this philosophy, I had a very kind of simplistic understanding. I tried to think how I can apply it to architecture in a very straightforward way. It doesn't work that way. I think what we're talking about here in terms of philosophy is not the forms of architecture, but challenging the thinking that's going on behind developing the forms of architecture, criticizing, in other words, the thinking of people like Kenneth Frampton, the thinking of people like Mario Carpo, people who were in architectural culture and yet being in some senses uncritically followed in some way, as though they are an authority. I wish that we could have some way of checking those things, of actually, doing a fact check, as it were. I'm sure that will happen in the future. This professor is talking nonsense kind of thing. AI will have to do us for that. But at the moment, we don't really have that. And what we do have is a series of experts we bring together the whole time to offer this advice and share it around the world. So I'm just hoping that this is going to make a contribution to architectural discourse worldwide, because it seems to me that we have a crisis in education, in that the good ideas at the moment are the province only of those who can afford to attend the good universities. That's not to say all the good universities have good professors, but nonetheless, to share it around so those in less fortunate parts of the world can also benefit from that. So I think that's all I could say is what the intention there is. It's not so straightforward and there's no so easy fix. It's not as though you can apply those things so easily, but we need to kind of in some way probe these things, and we need to kind of challenge the kind of confidence at which certain things are being put out there. I do think architectural discourse needs to be improved. If you look at the bestsellers, it is so disappointing. If you just go onto Amazon, check the best-selling books on architecture, unbelievable. People are still reading Vitruvius, for God's sake. They're still reading Christopher Alexander. They're still reading people like Learning from Las Vegas, books like Learning from Las Vegas. They're still reading Mario Carpo as well. I mean, so we need to kind of have a critical discourse in order to evaluate these things and be more critical. So that's all I could say. Yeah. So anyway, I think often these ideas they're kind of curious, they're strange, they don't necessarily fit into the architectural discourse. We're not familiar with them, we're not quite sure what to do with them. But I would just encourage you to kind of stick with them and to develop, above all, a critical inquiry about these things, because that in a way is going to help your architecture. I always think that what really made the particular generation of people like Rem Koolhaas or Bernard Schummi or Peter Reisman and so on so amazing, so significant, is that they were coming out of a really critical theoretical discourse from the 80s and before. And it's that, I think, that can really take us forward as architects, take us forward not just into theory terms, but also in terms of producing better designs for buildings. Still nothing in the chat. Okay. Well, let me just hold on just for a second in case there are some follow-up questions. But there's no need to carry on if we don't have to. Yeah. Okay, there's another question here. What do you look forward to in the immediate future for architecture and design, technology, science, and or art? Well, you know what I would love to see? In a way, I think the problems of the world are as often we become too polarized, not just in terms of countries, I don't know, China and America, for example, but also within those countries. So, for example, in the States, it seems to be that there's this divide between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's very partisan, and there's really no dialogue going on. And that problem of a lack of dialogue, I think, extends into this domain. In other words, we have different camps, and they're not in communication. Above all, there's a kind of like especially in terms of theory, almost all the theorists I know are negative about AI. I don't know why that is. But it's not very helpful. Now, if we could see a kind of a bridging, a connection, or at least an establishing of a dialogue that overcomes that divide between arts and sciences, then perhaps we can begin to move forward. And I think that's beginning to happen. And what I see from in the world of AI is a bridging not just between the arts and sciences, but between the professional world and the academic world, because we've had so many individuals as part of this series on architecture philosophy or architecture, AI, neuroscience, and architecture, who've been working in companies, super smart individuals, no question, super smart with PhDs, but working in some of these leading tech companies. If we can see that moving forward and we get a constructive dialogue, then I think that would be kind of healthy. But it's to have low dialogue, it seems to be problematic. That's not to say that when you have a dialogue, you're going to necessarily have any direct communication. I think one of the problems that I was talking about today is that things mean different things in different countries, different contexts. So you can have a term such as space that we use the whole time in architecture. That has a different meaning in the world of cultural theory, if you think about the work of Henri Lefebvre. So sometimes there are inherent misunderstandings. There are always going to be misunderstandings when you're coming from different contexts. But I hope in the end we'll end up with something which is a more productive dialogue. That at least is my hope. And that divide between art and science is something that is, it was troubling. It's been troubling. C.P. Snow wrote a book about the two cultures, where that is so obvious. And it's not necessary. It is absolutely not necessary. I think the problem about architecture, or the issue with architecture, is that we straddle both. Architecture is both born of an understanding of material behavior, of technologies, and so on. But it's also born of cultural discourses, of history and theory, and so on. And what I would like to see is not only the theorists being more engaged with technology, especially AI, because we have to, especially when AI could well play an important role in theory, but also the opposite. In other words, the technologists, to try and get beyond just simply fetishizing technology and saying, well, this is what a robot arm can do, and do something more akin to the kind of work of Behnaz Farahi, who is questioning it. Now, what is the social role of this technology? Don't just fetishize it for the sake of fetishizing it. Let's see how we can draw out its importance, because it does have an importance. So I guess that is what I would say, is to try and see how we could bring these two worlds together in some senses, and for the technologists here to be able to sort of see how we can use that technology in order to kind of look at cultural questions as well, or at least how we can rather see the technology through the lens of that, to see what is the significance of using that. And that precisely is what people are beginning to see about AI right now. Hold on a second, this is getting out of control. This is going to maybe causing a certain kind of set of cultural, social, political, economic problems in the future, which it probably is in some way, but we need to extend that to the whole of technology. Let's not sort of talk about a robotic arm doing this, in which case I could say, so what, and let's think about why you were doing it. It's not how or how much, but why. And these are the important questions I think that Lyotard, Jean-François Lyotard, raised in the 80s when he was commissioned to look at education. And he could see a kind of crisis in education. The Postmodern Condition is a book about education, where he says the problem with it is precisely that. In other words, we used to be asking the question why, and now contemporary culture is just simply about question of ticking boxes and crunching numbers, and it's more about how much and so on. Let's not think about that, but think about why. Ask the question why. Constantly keep that alive. So I think we can call a halt today. I can't see any other. Oh, hold on, wait, sorry. There's another question. Sorry. Okay. Can I think like this through this lecture? If AI has the same vision as our group or the same enemy, AI belongs to our group. Logic can be self-consistent. When it appears repeatedly, it is either repeating the source of childhood security or repeating the self-repulsive contradiction of logic, which is a kind of self-stabilization and irony. There is also the narrative of space that determines its meaning. If you look at it from the perspective of freedom, you can derive a lot of ideas and projections. Is this democracy? Let me read that out again. Can I think like this through this lecture? If AI has the same vision as our group or the same enemy, AI belongs to our group. Logic can be, okay, let me just, okay, hold on a second. AI at the moment is a tool that we can harness. It doesn't necessarily have, oh, there's some more questions here. It doesn't belong to any particular group, and I think it can be used for good or evil. I mentioned this story about the kitchen knife, right? A kitchen knife can either cut up vegetables or murder someone and things. And I think the problem often people have about technology is they're uncritical. There's what is called a technological determinism, where people say technology is good or technology is bad. Well, it's not inherently good or bad. It's how you use it, and that's the point. With AI, if you give it in the hands of Putin, you're liable to have problems, right? But if you use it in benign ways for medical services and things, it can be used usefully. So it's not as though it's necessarily anything. We could use it, and I think it's important from that point of view to understand it and to see how we can use it for the benefit of humanity. Otherwise, there'll be people hacking into it and using it for other areas. When it appears repeatedly, is it either repeating the source of childhood security or repeating the self-repulsive contradiction of logic, which is a kind of stabilization and irony? I think I tried today to kind of present two alternatives. I mean, one being the kind of the uncritical observation to something and just repeating it. That gets us nowhere. We just repeat things. I mean, history itself should be alive. History just repeats itself. It's not going anywhere. And then let's think about it. Everyone in history was a kind of revolutionary in some ways. Alberti was certainly revolutionary the way I see him, but if we go back and start styling ourselves like Alberti and wearing the same clothes and designing the same columns, that's not being Alberti. That is just being a traditionalist. He was against the traditionalists. He was challenging things. He was introducing the new Italian language that up until then had just been a kitchen language, and he wrote his books in Italian. He was part of the revolution. So just the nihilist, and this is what Derrida says, the nihilistic repetition of things without questioning them is very, very negative. So we need to kind of question things. But I think what I was trying to say today, and this is the contribution of Homi Bhabha, is that repetition can be critical. We can challenge things repeatedly by a kind of mocking and mimicry and so on. There's also narrative space that determines its meaning. If you look at it from the perspective of freedom, you can derive a lot of ideas and projections. Is this democracy? Let me just simply say this. I teach in the States where everybody has this idea that the States is the country of freedom. I have a story of one of my Russian, she's now British, but Russian PhD student of mine who's from Russia. And she was telling me when in the 90s, when Glasnost, when this kind of spirit of openness in Russia under Gorbachev began to open up, there was an advertisement where they were offering a free trip for 2 weeks in Russia, in the States, for Russian students, and they had a competition, and the best students got on this plane, 200 places, and she was exceptionally smart, and she got a place. And it was only when they were going across the states, across the Atlantic, they began to realize who had been sponsoring this. It was one of these new age religions called the Moonies. Doesn't matter exactly what it's called, but and the idea, of course, was they were going to take them there. They're going to inculcate them with the thinking of this new age religion and send them back to Russia and have a new empire of new religious empire out there. But what they didn't take into account is the fact that these Russians, they knew about indoctrination, they knew about propaganda, they knew about all this, and the stuff they were trying to tell them or indoctrinate them with was like water off a duck's back. They paid no attention to it, and they basically went to go and get hamburgers and have Coca-Cola and to buy Nike sneakers, which is what they did, and they all came back apart from one particular student who absconded and stayed in the States. So and I think the problem about American students is they think they're free. Absolutely not. I think we're all constrained by ideology. This is mentioned, like I mentioned briefly in this course, but it's important to recognize this. Louis Althusser is the guy who talks most interestingly about technology, about ideology, and he says there are two forms of control. There's the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. And the repressive state apparatus we know too well. That's the military, that's the police, they're controlling us. Okay, we can see that. But what is more insidious, because it's invisible, is the ideological state apparatus, the way we are indoctrinated and our thinking is conditioned, and we all are indoctrinated. Nobody escapes that. So the idea that people are free is really a problem, or thinking you're free, because really you are as indoctrinated as anyone else. Except I would say that maybe some of those Russians were less indoctrinated than the Americans, because at least they realized that they were being indoctrinated. Vasco's question. How does your nomadic lifestyle moving from England to Germany to the USA influence your sense of home and belongings? When you're a nomad, you're a nomad from something. You have to have a point of departure. In order to be a nomad, there's got to be an origin, as in some senses. And the strange thing is that I don't know. I've got a little mini car outside, which is British, and I didn't actually buy it because it was British. Well, it's now owned by Germany, but I bought it because I could put my surfboard in it. But in some ways, it also reinforces something about that you get to appreciate where you came from. And I keep my British passport. I've not become an American citizen. But it's funny because we had one student in Dessau, Iku, who was from Japan, who was very un-Japanese. But she came to Dessau and then she began to realize how Japanese she was. So I think it's always dialectical. A nomad is actually not so much of a nomad as maybe you think. And I think the notion of the dialectic, whereby you can see the opposite in anything, is precisely the case. But I do think, I think that one thing I always, when at an early age, I don't think I mentioned this in this course, but at an early age, I realized the importance, the necessity of decontextualizing yourself, of stepping outside of your own world, because it really helps in some senses. And it was when I was 10 years old or something, we were watching this football match on TV in Germany, because my parents lived in Germany at the time. And we had the German TV on because we didn't have, it was all terrestrial TV in those days. And we had the English radio on. And it was two accounts of the same reality, which I was stunned by, because I thought, okay, it's a football match, But actually, what happened was that when let's say the David Beckham of the day took a shot at goal, the English commentator said, "Oh, fantastic shot," and the German commentator said, "Fantastic save." I realized that actually there are two ways of thinking about the world. So I would say it's really important for everyone to step outside of your comfort zone, to expose yourself to different cultures and different ways of thinking in order to kind of remain alive. And I find it distressing that so few people in the States have got a passport. And apparently Bush didn't have a passport until he became president. He hasn't been abroad. It's important to actually go to step outside, to see things in their context, to decontextualize yourself and operate in that way. And the Architectural Association is a wonderful example of that. You know, it's in London, but it's not in London. You know, it's a culture whereby when I was teaching there, I didn't have a single British student. And they go from there, they go work for Zaha. And I mean, the office of 400, there were 6 people who were British there. And I think that idea of being decontextualized, that is what really kind of promotes good education and good architecture. So I would encourage everyone else to have a nomadic lifestyle, just to kind of break free in sometimes. How do you navigate the tensions between global influences and local specificities in your writings and teaching? Sorry, let me read that again. How do you navigate the tensions between global influences and local specificities in your writings and teaching? Actually, again, I think it's kind of dialectical. In fact, we almost have to think of it in terms of the global and how does the regional and the local feed into one another. I don't know. I'm not sure what I can say about that, except that I think it's fascinating to find out about how other people think and to, I've always been curious about that, and not just other people in other countries, but other people in other disciplines. And I think that we can only be enriched by experiencing other cultures. My one problem, in a sense, going back to what we're talking about today, is post-colonial discourse. Is that emanating out of the center? It's coming out of places like Columbia University. I mean, that's where Gayatri Spivak teaches. That's what Edward Said was teaching. That's where Kenneth Frampton was teaching until very recently. It's the center kind of pontificating and telling the periphery what to do. And frankly, Homi Bhabha also has been teaching in Harvard. I would prefer to listen to what's going on in what's called the periphery, or not even have a concept of the center and the periphery, to be able to see that we're all part of a network and we can all learn from each other. We had a session, I don't know if anyone saw it, but a session on Bangladesh, which was like on digital futures, one of the most astonishing sessions that we had, with a really amazing designer, Tabassum, I forget it, Marina Tabassum. And I didn't know about her. But she was absolutely amazing. And I think the real problem right now is that we still haven't got beyond this kind of Western-centered sort of view of the thing. The Pritzker Prize, apparently she was nominated and they give it to David Chipperfield. Well, nothing against David Chipperfield, but that guy has had a privileged upbringing, okay? How does someone from a place like Bangladesh break into that? We're always, in a sense, being marginalized, or they're being marginalized. I personally just wish that she had got that prize so that we could actually move forward, And that's what in a way we even the UK, what is it? The UK got to boast. One of the things it's got to boast, frankly, is the office, Zaha Hadid Architects. That was someone from a Muslim country, female, coming into a male-dominated Western society and shaking it up. I wish that Marina Tabassum had been given the Pritzker Prize, because I think we've got a lot to learn from it. Then so there's one from I can't pronounce these Polish names. My apologies. Jesigwe Zukowski. In your view, what is the main problem that AI could help address in architecture and the use of space? Well, I think my view is that we are limited. I don't buy the idea that we're so fantastic. And just to go back to the AA for a second, I think one thing that really became very illuminating to me was a review that I went to years ago, and there was one student who wasn't bad, but he said, I've looked at the possibilities, there's 6. And you think, why 6? And then another student who's really, really very good had said, I've looked at the possibilities, I ran them through the computer, and they're 543, and most of them are all the same, but here they are. That's what I think they can be used to enhance us, to improve us, to help our thinking. And we need to recognize that we are not as good as we thought we are, and to use it as a prosthesis to the human imagination, as an augmentation to help us to improve in some way. That seems to me the way that we need to use AI. And in terms of the space, well, hopefully the spaces that are being produced are going to be much better because of that. Whether that's going to help all the way down the line is another question. Of course, the bigger questions are coming up. So there's another question from Liu Hui. Thank you for your questions, because you've been asking questions all week. Building camouflage itself in the context or jump out of the context, like people always blend in the society, but also want to be seen. People have a sense of belonging. Will machines have that? Ah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I was pretty sure I knew the answer until about 3 weeks ago, until 4 weeks, I don't know when it was, when I heard Geoffrey Hinton saying that he thought machines were thinking. They can't. Maybe is the answer. Maybe. I just would say this is that, people, I heard someone the other day say, why didn't people think about this at the beginning? Why didn't they realize that this was going to do this and so on? And well, AI was going to get out of control. Well, frankly, everyone was thinking about the potential of this. And there were certain things that didn't become obvious until recently. And that is the fact that actually these things are, they are harnessing some kind of intelligence. And it is astonishing intelligence. It's not the same as ours, but it is astonishing. God, who knows? I mean, so there are things you can't predict. There are things you can't predict. And I mentioned before, you can produce a tool, and that's easy, hopefully, self-driving car or the iPhone or whatever it was, but you don't know how people are going to use those things, and it's almost impossible to predict. So it's not as though. So I think those questions, why didn't they think about this? Well, they did think about this, and frankly, the real problem was the rest of the world wasn't thinking about AI, until suddenly ChatGPT comes along and people wake up. Half the time, some of these thinkers and people like Ray Kurzweil are talking about things that no one's listening to. Well, there are some people listening to, but of course, Ray Kurzweil in 2012 or 2013 was talking about pandemics. He was talking about the danger of pandemics. Nobody was paying attention to him. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure what to say there. Perspectiva. Okay. So machines have that. Will they have a long sense of belonging? I think they might do. They might do. I don't know. And of course, we might also learn something from machines and develop something from them as well. So it's not a simple question of AI catching up with us, but maybe us catching up with AI. Perspective freedom. I mean, people can choose what to see. Up to a point. I think that there was a famous comment that was made by Donald Rumsfeld. Now, how does it go now? I'm not fresh in my mind, but it's something like, there are some things that we know, and there's some things that we don't know, and there's some things that we know we don't know. In other words, there are some things that we know, and there's some things that we don't know. That's easy enough. There's some things that we know we don't know. We know that there are cars outside in the car park, but we don't know how many. I mean, that would be an example of that. And then Slavoj Zizek said there's a fourth one. There's a fourth one that he hasn't taken into consider. And there are things that we don't know that we know. And that's, I think, the problem of ideology. In other words, we don't realize that we've been trapped by it, and we've been conditioned in a certain sort of way, and been to think in a certain sort of way. So that's my concern about having any freedom at all, And I think that the myth that's been propagated in architectural culture is it's all about experimentation and freedom, and the more progressive the school, the more freedom, and so on. But one of the things I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned today, but I mentioned in my writing, is to say, well, I don't think that's the case. I think that actually we are trained very particularly to go and do certain things. We are trained how to design a building. And if we do something that doesn't look like what we're expected to produce, then we're rejected. And I always use the example of the pineapple. If you design a building like a pineapple, terrible. You should be selling fruit. Don't become an architect. You've got to do this. You've got to do this, and you've got to make it look like Norman Foster or Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry or Tom Main or whatever. Herzog and Amur, and so on and so on and so on, but not the same. And that's something I think that people don't realize that they're part of. That actually there is a canon of architecture. We are expected to conform to the canon of architecture, and we copy. That's what we do. We copy these guys. We absorb Rem Koolhaas, and it kind of comes out and so on. And we don't even know we're doing that. We're not even aware that we're doing that. I don't think we have necessarily the freedom we think we have. And I don't think we are as progressive as we think we are, because we're copying other people. So you certainly can say choose what you see, and you can certainly be selective in your vision, and be selective with your hearing, and selective in all sorts of things, which is say you kind of ignore certain things, but you focus on other things. I mean, I do that the whole time with the news, right? I don't know. I want to hear when Ukraine is doing well, not when it's doing badly. So I won't read any reports about Ukraine doing badly, And I think we are selective about that. We listen to the news we want. I think that's the problem in some ways. The people from, let's say, Fox News will only look at Fox News because they don't want to hear what CNN says, and people from CNN will only listen to CNN because they won't know what Fox News says, and that's what's leading to the big divide in America. So selective vision, selective hearing, selective news, selective all those things can be problematic. Yeah. That's a good point. I think I'm not quite sure what you were trying to say, but I think that was it. Oh my God, there's another one. Okay. The quote, reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are some there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know that we don't know. Okay, that's the quote. Someone's put that in there. That's useful. So maybe I got that wrong. There are known knowns. That's right. Okay, there are known knowns. We know it, and there are known unknowns. That's the cars in the car park. And then there are the unknown unknowns, the one we don't know. But there was an intervention by Slavoj Zizek where he said the real problem is that we have unknown knowns. That's the real problem. How we are conditioned and don't realize we're conditioned. Yeah. Well, that's been great. Okay, so we should we can wrap up. So, I mean, by all means, follow Digital Futures. We're trying to do something, maybe naively, but we're trying to do something. This is the international group of Digital Futures, to open things up. And we have sessions every week in these 6 different languages, and we've got these workshops, these online workshops in 6 different languages coming up. And we've got the closing ceremony. And what we're trying to do is we moved with the pandemic, we moved from being located and just constrained to one university to opening up and being not constrained to any university. So it's now a kind of global movement that's not constrained by any particular country, any particular language, any particular city, or any particular university. It's completely universal. And I'm hoping that it can spread, and not just spread just in the area of the computational world, but also architecture as a whole and other disciplines, because we need to have some way of sharing information and sharing our passion about the subject. So let's hope, and hope you will be, some of you here will become part of the movement. And I want to thank those who are also already part of the movement for all the work that goes into this. You don't know how much goes into this. Every single poster, every single transmission, every single operation, there's a whole team working on it. And I just want to thank those who have been part of this and putting this together. And hopefully it's been useful. It'll be up on our YouTube channel with everything else. So if you want to find it, I don't know if we can put down the connection in the YouTube channel as well, but we'll make sure we do somehow or another. So DigitalFutures.international will give you the international organization with all the references to all the YouTube channel and all to the online events that are going to happen in a few weeks' time. So anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for listening and bearing up with me and putting up with my British accent, with my complete perverse approach to everything, and whatever, and also the technological glitches that came and went on. My apologies today, I couldn't have the sound on that final video, but I wasn't able to connect my laptop with the sound as I was in the previous sessions. So there we go. Anyway, so thank you so much, and see you again sometime. And thank you also, Gustavo, for asking those incredible questions. I owe you several pints. You're going to get drunk. Okay, thank you so much then. Okay, all right, thanks.